being squatters who government is pushing out of areas they have called home for years without a settlement plan. Majority of those affected are in Mau Forest and Kibera, right in the capital, where the government has a spirited campaign to conserve the water tower and a road project, respectively. In Kibera alone, 1,000 people will be homeless once the demolitions that started today are complete. In Masai Mau, 7,000 people are already sleeping in the cold after their houses were torched by the enforcers of the eviction notice. Among the 7,000 evictees are students from 15 schools that have been closed indefinitely. Some may never reopen. Now, besides these two major evictions, 4 other mass movements of people have gone unnoticed this year. And again, all forceful evictions by the government. This is even as the government vouches for its Big Four agenda that includes affordable housing. My colleague Akisa Wandera spoke to a communications officer from Kura earlier today, and he confirmed no compensations will be extended to those affected. We're going to listen into that soundbite from the Deputy Director of Communications from Kura shortly. But for now, let me cross over, or actually I shall be speaking to lawyer Manuel Jose, who is with me right here in studio. I'm also going to speak to the chairman of the Nubian Rights Forum, Shafi Hussein, and Amnesty International Executive Director Rungu Houghton, who's going to join me from our CBD studios. We invited the National Land Commission, but they declined a TV interview. Before we hear from my panel tonight, let me bring in our lead reporter, Sophia Onuna, for more insights on these emotive issues. Sophia, good evening.
Good evening, Yusuf. As you mentioned, these evictions we've witnessed now in Kibera ongoing, targeted 30,000 residents in that area to be removed for the road reserve, to be able to continue as part of the development projects under the Jubilee administration. We've also been talking about and highlighting the stories around the Mau Reserve and water tower as well. Evictions have been going on there, a lot of politicization around that as well. And one of the biggest concerns that has emerged, aside from whether it is right or wrong, it's the human rights question. And tonight we're seeking to get insights from the Vice Chair of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, George Morara, with me. We're here at the offices of Lenana Road. Thank you, sir, for making time for us. I wonder what your sense is. A lot has been said across the board. We've witnessed these evictions. Today, we're talking about Kibera. The past couple of days have been a lot of political rhetoric on what's been going on in Mau. An overview from you.
Well, thank you so much, Sophia, for having me on your show tonight. Let me start by saying that what has happened in actually Kibera today is absolutely unfortunate. This is not what we expected to see, especially if we call ourselves a country that is governed by the rule of law, a country that respects its own people. The construction of the road in Kibera, absolutely necessary, important. Nobody was saying that the road shouldn't be there, but it's the manner in which it has been done. Sophia, I want the viewers to know that this matter was brought before Justice Okongo in 2012 to give directions on the passage of this road. And Justice Okongo, on the 28th of April 2017, gave very clear directions. And some of those directions were that before the evictions happen, especially in Kibera on that bypass the road, there should be proper enumeration of the project affected persons. And this included both the structure owners as well as the tenants. That was over a year ago. What is shocking is that it's only recently, and again with the intervention of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, a meeting that our chairperson was very instrumental in convening, that was the 10th of July. That again now we sat together at the table with Kura to talk about, let's start the process of enumerating the people who are going to be affected by the project, completely against even the orders of the court that had been given in 28th April 2017, that indeed this process should be done in a humane manner and all this. What is shocking is that as a country we have the IDPs Act that gives a very good guideline on how evictions should be done from a human rights perspective. As a country, we also have the UN guidelines that give a clear strategy on evicting people. But importantly, we have the Land Act of 2012 that was revised in 2016. None of these legal frameworks were adhered to in the evictions of Kibera. Neither have they been adhered to even in places like Mau.
Yeah. Earlier today, we hosted, during the news desk, Akisa Ndera interviewing one of the officials from Kura, and who talked about, in terms of, was there a notice to leave and vacate this land in Kibera, for instance? It was given. In terms of remuneration, he spoke about there are those with title deeds. For them, it's clear in law they'll be remunerated, but for the others, it's a goodwill gesture. What do you make of those kind of sentiments?
I think those sentiments are unfortunate, and I know you're attributing these comments to what Cheboy said. When we sat at that table, all these actors ourselves, the National Land Commission, other actors like Amnesty International, we were very clear that indeed it is not the goodwill of the government that was the instrumental thing, but following the legal processes and procedures. So for Cheboy to come and say a notice was given, we are saying, and I've said earlier, they had 1 year to do this well. Cheboy is saying that the enumeration exercise started on the 16th. It was actually done by the 20th. If you saw their press release, they gave out a press release on the 20th. That press release also purported to act as an eviction notice. The press release that was released on Friday, the 20th, was not shared and circulated until today. So in terms of all the procedures and the available principles of evictions, what Kura has done flies in the face of all the laid down procedures and principles. The notice has to be adequate, it has to be sufficient, there has to be adequate consultations of all the people who are going to be affected by this project. You don't get that sense. In fact, if it was a question of goodwill, that goodwill should have come from Kura itself and the National Land Commission. And one of the things that they'd actually assured us as a gesture of goodwill is that they were not going to demolish the schools. Today is the 23rd. The school's only 1 week, and the students, the pupils will be on vacation. They'll have had ample time to do the exams and all this. But what do? Even after agreeing with them, because there are 4 broad areas of agreement. So if Cheboy is talking about goodwill, the goodwill should have come from their end, first by respecting the moratorium that we reached. But as we speak, Sophia, and I've spoken to the office of the Honorable Ken Okoth, the statistics from Kibera are very worrying. Already about 8 schools have been affected. We have a Egesa Children's Center, as you can see, that had 400 students from grade 1 to grade 4. That was demolished. We have Makina Self-Help Center, which was housing quite a considerable number of pupils, about 800 of them from grade 1 to grade 8. The sheer destruction and the sheer disruption that is actually being occasioned on these children this late in the term is completely unconscionable. It's not acceptable. If Kura is telling us that is government land, as I said earlier, nobody's saying no, that's not government land. The people who are living there are also Kenyan people. Right. The greatest resource we have in this country. In as much as that road is important, it's not that road, but it's the citizens of this country, the people living in Kibera. That is our greatest resource. And the way we treat them should actually show that we value them and we care about them. But to just go there, destroy and remove them against the laid-down procedures, then I think that is not how we should be running our affairs as a country.
Largely what we hear from government agencies and officials is the frustration around there'll be notices, there'll be engagements, as those you've talked about that have happened already, but that when it comes down to it, there's always a hesitance. There's always that, antagonistic now encounter of will we leave, will we not? It's never smooth. We never see it when it comes to evictions. It always gets to a point where it hits ahead, every party is concerned, no matter the kind of negotiations and talks that happened before, because there'll be the resistance that will be faced at the end of the day. In your view, how best can this be done? Because are talks happening? Yes, clearly. But when it comes down to it, we still have concerns.
What is the duration of those talks that are happening, Sophia? Actually, our teams have been on the ground in Kibera. I can tell you for a fact, everybody was agreed that they are going to move out of that road reserve. So that conversation was actually had. And among the first things that were agreed upon was there was going to be the marking of the area where the road was going to pass, the placing of the beacons. That happened. So there's no problem with that. Number 2, there was supposed to be proper enumeration of all the people who are going to be affected, as I said earlier, the project-affected persons. That happened, but from where we stand, we don't think that that happened well. And the people of Kibera who have been affected by this have legitimate fears. And why do I say so? Even the forms that Kura used to enumerate these people, and we have about 2,500 households that were affected, they didn't have a serial number. When we asked, again, in the spirit of good faith, because we are partners in this process, can you share with us the forms of the people that you've enumerated? And this being Kenya, we don't want those numbers to go there to Kura and then they are manipulated by other actors. Why wouldn't Kura, in good faith, share with us even the records of the people they have enumerated? It's become absolutely difficult for us to get those records. It's become very difficult for the office of the Honorable Ken Okoth, the Kibera Member of Parliament, to get those records. So I'm actually saying Kenyans are not difficult people to really deal with. They know what the law is. They are willing to follow through. But the bargain should be from both sides. Okay. The government should carry its part of the bargain. The citizens should carry their part of the bargain. So if this was done properly, we should have seen the conversations that we laid the groundwork. The marking of the land, tick. The enumeration, tick. Now, after that, after we've done the PAP, the project-affected persons, what is the resettlement action plan? So where are you going next and all this? So again, this idea of ambushing your people as if they're a bunch of the wildebeest crossing the Mara doesn't help anybody. These are citizens of this country. They deserve to be treated with dignity. And if you engage them constructively, it can be done. I'm saying this from a position of knowledge, because as a commission, we've engaged with residents of that Kibera. When we were giving out the slum upgrading houses, there were problems here and there. We engaged constructively over a long period of time. That process was done smoothly. There was no problem. So again, let's not cast Kenyans as a difficult group of people. On the contrary, let's be calling out the duty bearers who don't want to play by the rules that they themselves have set out.
All right.
Yes.
Finally, let's talk about Mau, because that has been a hot topic in the past few weeks, and a lot of it has largely been hearing what the politicians have to say. And the worst part of it is that I think what would be agreed by all parties that we need to conserve what is the biggest water tower in the country. But this has been an issue, administration after the other. In your view, seeing these people, their houses have been burnt, the children are out of school, but the forest, the water tower must be protected. How do we reconcile the issues that are at play in Mau?
Again, what we saw on the media, the torching of houses, the mass evictions of people and all this clearly flies against the IDP Act, the UN guidelines on evictions and all that. Nobody is saying that those people who are there should not be removed so that the Mau is conserved. Again, it's the manner in which it's done. If we come up with laws, Sophia, let's also have the goodwill to implement those laws. Otherwise, they'll be just good pieces of law on paper without any practice. But looking at the Mau and the other forest towers, this commission is actually part of a process of handling that Mau complex. There was a task force that was formed specifically to handle the Ogiek matter, because the Ogiek went to the African Commission. They were given a ruling communication from the African Commission on Human and People's Rights that they're indeed indigenous people in that forest. So what we need to do is to balance, and this is the challenge that we are also having in the Embobut forest. It's a challenge we are going to have in the Boni forest and all this. Our constitution recognizes that there are people who are indigenous, who get their livelihood from the forest. For those people, there has to be a special arrangement for them to really access the forest, use it as their ancestral home. Now, for all the other intruders who have even gone to the forest against the laid down laws and processes and procedures, they should be removed from these water towers. Again, not in the manner that we saw of what was happening in Mau, burning houses, burning schools and all this. There has to be proper ways of doing it. And again, just Kibera and Mau, we cannot replicate those bad practices that we've seen in Mau.
In Mau. Thank you very much. George Murara, Vice Chair of the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for that. And just a reminder, we still have a lawyer in studio with us. That is Manuel Jose, who's going to tell us perhaps what are the next options for those affected in Kibera today. We also have Amnesty International Executive Director Irungu Houghton, as well as Shafi Hussein from Kibera, as the chairman of the Nubian Rights Forum. But before we start over our discussion tonight, let's listen in to what Kura had to say about today's demolition, and especially with regards to the issue of compensation.
This is a land that belongs to government. You cannot compensate that belongs to government, because you can compensate somebody who is having a title. These people have no title. Two, when they started constructing also, they were aware that this is a corridor meant for, set aside for roads.
There is an official from Kura there speaking to my colleague Akisa Wandera earlier. And still in studio we have lawyer Manuel Jose, Shafi Hussein, and Amnesty International Executive Director Mr. Irungu Houghton. Good evening, gentlemen, and welcome to the program. Irungu Houghton, let me begin with you. And I'm sure you heard your officials on the ground. I understand Amnesty International has also released a statement with regards to today's demolition. Can you perhaps tell us how bad was it, and in what manner was the demolition conducted?
So just to be clear, Yusuf, and good evening. Not only were my staff on the ground today, but I personally went to Kibera this morning and spent 2 hours there and saw for myself the shock and disbelief as houses, kiosks, schools were demolished in front of people. The sight of children carrying textbooks that they had to remove from the debris of schools, the sight of children carrying water buckets that had been left in their homes. Very, very many people were not prepared for this demolition this morning. And as we know, it's going to run for the next 2 days. We only have seen damage and destruction in Makina, but in the other 3 villages, it seems that works is set to continue. And I think we have to see this development with a lot of concern. It is not true that the enumeration and the resettlement action plan had completed its course. If, from what we know of global standards of resettlement action plans, it involves also being able to relocate people and to find alternative shelter for them. And this just was not the case today. There are many people who will be sleeping in the dark and the cold this evening as a result of this action. Well, and the question we all need to ask is, where was our government when this was happening? Yes,
we're going to talk about the resettlement action plan shortly, but let me bring in Shafi into this conversation. Shafi, were you informed by Kura, or were you given any kind of notice by Kura? Because they're saying apparently that they did issue some sort of notice to the people of Kibera.
Good evening, Mr. Yusuf. And first of all, the notice which has been given, that is not the way of giving notice. That notice has been spread all over the road, and by the mostly by the roadside. And the notice has been spread out around 3 a.m. So when people wake in the morning, they find the notice lying around. And the notice should be served to those who are in the road corridors. So to me, that is so unfortunate. First of all, that is not a notice. Yeah.
So what are the people of Kibera planning to do? Because Kura says they will also continue with the demolition exercise tomorrow. They've already cleared Makina, I understand, and there are 2 more sections that they're planning to demolish. What are the people of Kibera saying about this?
Of course, the people of Kibera have nothing to say rather than they just want to tell His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta that just keep on doing whatever you are doing, but follow the law. And the people of Kibera, everybody knows that they are totally poor. We have people in Kibera who, if got a cup of tea in the morning, which we call it a strong tea, cannot afford even to get a piece of ugali during the lunchtime or in the evening. So those are totally poor people. And whatever, what they've seen today with the demolition of the so-called Agenda 4, That is very sad and very unfortunate.
Yes, Shafi. Now, let me bring Wakil into this. And Wakil, you've had Shafi's plight there, talking, of course, on behalf of the people of Kibera. From a legal point of view, from a legal perspective, what are some of the other options out there for the people of Kibera? Because it's also the government responsibility to settle these people, right?
Sure. Thank you, Yusuf. I think this issue actually is coming from the human rights perspective, and from listening from the leaders and everyone, it's very clear that the National Land Commission and Kenya Urban Roads Authority followed the process and gave the people of Kibera sufficient notice to actually vacate. But our laws have developed in such a way that you cannot forcibly push people out of their households and out of their homes, even if those homes are built within government property. There is a process that needs to be done, to be followed before you remove people from a place for purpose of development. We have seen this go on, and we have seen actually complaints being raised. If you can play and see the way the police officers have been moving those people, it actually violates the human rights of the people and the human dignity as enshrined under the Constitution. These people are human beings, and their source of livelihood comes from that place. At the same time, that is where they reside, and they have known to reside for a long time. There need to be a settlement plan. Previously, we had a stakeholder agreement known as the Resettlement Action Plan, which provided that every eviction that is carried out in any place within the country must be actually, the human rights aspect must be looked into. Destruction of property by police officers and forceful eviction doesn't have a place in our laws. And so I think the Kibera people have a right to actually come out and demonstrate and actually question the process of eviction itself. I think to that extent, they have a right that needs to be protected by the government.
Yes, and unfortunately, we couldn't get a single representative from government. We did try to invite officials from the National Lands Commission. They didn't grant us an interview. Now, let me engage Irungu Houghton once again. And from the soundbite that we did play earlier from one of the officials from Kura, this is what he had to say, that the land in question belongs to government, that they cannot make compensation for people who don't have titles, and that the locals know this is an area that has been set aside for roads. What do you have to say about that?
I think government responsibility does not stop at giving people notice that they're going to evict them from their homes and from their livelihoods. I think what we know is that many of the people who live in the urban settlements do not live there primarily out of choice. They live there out of necessity and have responding to poverty and inequality. So I think a humane government would immediately have begun to think about what is the relationship between slum upgrading and the conditions within which the families of Kibera currently live. And the first thing would have been perhaps to have identified areas where the slum upgrading was going to take place and then humanely move people to that space. But to do it in this manner really does not make any sense at all. In fact, if anything, it is just displacing community from one slum settlement to another slum settlement. And we know the history of this, as we have had many examples of historically. So I think we need to be very clear in our demand of government that if you are serious about creating affordable, dignified housing for all Kenyans, then you have to prepare the ground for that before you displace people, or just declare that there are some Kenyans or some families that are of a lesser god. And apparently, apart from people's property, there are schools that are going to be affected. Today, we understand that 2 schools were demolished. That is Makina Self-Help Primary School and Pride Center. There's also a children's home that have been affected. So, Irungu, from your own point of view, does this, shed light to a government that is lax in planning? Because these schools were also built by the same government that is demolishing it. No, I think on this one, the government has missed the ball. And I think the I think the blame must be placed very firmly on the Ministry of Transport, and in particular the Directorate of Public Works, because I think the instruction that came to demolish this community or the community that are on this road reserve came from the multi-sectoral task force that has been set up essentially to take actions like this. And I think we've heard from Kura that this is not the first or the last of the demolitions that we can expect this week or even next week. And there are a number of communities that we are concerned about this moment. So I think it really requires the government, and in particular the presidency, to think very carefully about initiating a moratorium so that we can have a conversation about how evictions are carried out in this country. But forced evictions have no place in our laws. They have no place in the international community. And I think all we are seeing essentially is greater impoverishment of communities that had very little to start with.
Now, Shafi, from your perspective, Kura says that they're not going to compensate people from Kibera because you didn't have any kind of title deeds, and they're not going to, deal with anyone who doesn't have that crucial document. What do you have to say about that first?
Article 40 sub-article 4 is very clear. And that is what we've seen Mr. Cheboy talks about and say they are going to give something in goodwill. But my friend Mr. Cheboy has forgotten something. That goodwill, the way he's putting, is not right. So he has to understand what Article 40 is stated very clearly. That is number one. Number two, there's the Nubian community who got their title deed in 2016. But if you go through that title deed, you'll see that title deed has been issued in 2013. So that is, I think that is a challenge, which I think our lawyer will have to seek guidance in court.
Yes, well said, Shafi. Speaking about the law, let me bring him into this conversation once again. Now, Wakili, you've had Shafi's point of view there. What should the government do in future to avoid this kind of an occurrence? And is it about time that we review, the eviction laws in this country?
I think, Yusuf, our laws are very clear. And especially land laws in this country are extremely clear as to how government and people should actually, when they find themselves in situations of this kind, operate. We have, the government has eminent domain. Under the law, the government owns all lands within this republic, and it has a right to actually take away that land, but the law protects that person who owns that land through compensation. So if a government exercises its what we call adverse possession and compulsory acquisition, of a land within a locality, then those people have a right to be compensated. In this case, in this particular case, this was not an issue of adverse possession. These people have not been staying here for a period of 12 or more years without any interruption. For them to claim to actually benefit from government through compensation on adverse possession. At the same time, they do not have any title that was issued by any government authority to actually have them within that premise. And so what now remains is that these are Kenyans who just settled in a place which was clear marked for development, or rather for construction of the road. And so I think the only recourse and the only honorable thing that the government should do is to actually ensure that there's humane in the process of eviction of these people. They ought to be given sufficient time to relocate to another place, or government has a responsibility of relocating these people to another place. If we send away these people the way it was done today, they will go to another government premise and actually start their livelihoods there. So this will be a problem that will recur again and again if we don't have a constant solution to the issue of people who do not have a place to reside. And as it has been stated before, I think government has enough resources and capacity to actually relocate these people who are now, don't have a place to sleep. And as the Human Rights Commission has stated, there's so many human rights violations going on, and as a country we have impressed the respect for human rights under the Bill of Rights in this country, and we need to actually ensure that nobody suffers, especially for purposes of development. The roads are for the good of the public, but at the same time, we don't need to actually forcibly take away the people's dignity by, leaving them homeless. Yes.
Well said. And before we take a break here, let me bring Irungu Holton once again to this conversation. Now, Irungu, you've already had the Kura officials saying that they've completed the first phase today, the 2 sections that they're still going to demolish in the course of this week, that is tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. They've also earmarked several places around parklands. What are we likely going to see in the next few coming days? I
think if today is anything that we can go by, we will see very many people displaced. We will see children not able to complete term 2 of their education and possibly not find places in order to complete the final term of the year. We will see lots of businesses destroyed and property that has been built up over the years. And I think, these images that we're seeing on our screens really should touch us that, in many cases, these are very humble homes that I think, as Shafi has said, are built up with very humble income. And I think, the concern that I have is that we're in a very cold season. Many of us are struggling, even in permanent houses, to find warmth and shelter. And to leave, any Kenyan out in this environment not only is a, is a violation of our basic human rights, but our Bill of Rights, but it's also something that has to be described as immoral and unethical, and it needs to stop. So I really implore the government to rethink this line of action. And if we could just link it up to perhaps the Mao, and I know you wanted to talk about this later, but let me just bring it up. Conservation and development are really important for this country, but if we have to displace people, if we have to forcibly remove people from their homes and their livelihoods, then I wonder what is the purpose of conservation and development if you have to displace people in order to achieve this. Surely we can't. Surely we can do both, that we can have actually forest-dwelling people and communities resettled without any harm to those communities that are the most vulnerable of our society. Well said, Irungu Holton. Of course, as you've rightly mentioned, we're going to talk about Mau and much more after this, a very short break. Of course, you'll be watching the big story right here on KTN News. We'll continue with this conversation, of course, and still talk about the conservation matter in Mau, which has been highly politicized, I must say. Of course, we're going to come back shortly. Stay with us.
This is KTN News.